The secure phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m. in the Oval Office, cutting through the suffocating Washington silence. Trump's fingers drummed impatiently on the mahogany desk as his chief of staff delivered the intelligence briefing. Sir, Ibrahim Traoré just nationalized 3 more French mining operations in Burkina Faso. The room's tension was palpable, shadows dancing across the presidential seal. Outside, rain pelted the bulletproof windows like an omen. Trump's jaw clenched as he processed the implications for American corporate interests. This African upstart thinks he can challenge the established order. Within hours, the machinery of international law was set into motion with surgical precision. The Department of Justice worked through the night, crafting charges of economic terrorism and destabilizing democratic institutions. Legal experts huddled in dimly lit conference rooms, their faces illuminated by laptop screens. The warrant was designed to isolate Traoré from the international community completely. Trump's voice echoed through the secure video conference. I want him in chains within 72 hours. The order reverberated through embassy networks across 3 continents. Every detail was calculated to send a message to any African leader with similar ambitions. By dawn, encrypted messages flooded diplomatic channels from Washington to Ouagadougou. The American embassy in Burkina Faso received instructions to coordinate with Interpol immediately. French intelligence agencies, still smarting from their mining losses, eagerly offered logistical support. The warrant painted Traoré as a threat to global economic stability and democratic values. News outlets received carefully crafted leaks about an imminent international police action. The narrative was clear. A dangerous dictator would face justice. Trump's team believed they had cornered their target perfectly. But in the red dust of Ouagadougou, something unexpected was already stirring among the people. Market vendors whispered urgently as they arranged their colorful fabrics under the morning sun. University students gathered in spontaneous groups there, voices rising with indignation and pride. The baobab trees seemed to stand, taller as if ancient spirits were awakening. Traoré's phone remained silent, but his advisors knew the storm was coming. The sound of traditional drums began echoing from distant neighborhoods. A line had been crossed, and Africa would not remain silent. The countdown to confrontation had begun. The morning call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly in his modest office. His aide burst through the door, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. Captain, the Americans have issued an international warrant for your arrest. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of motorcycle taxis navigating the dusty streets. Traoré's weathered hands remained steady as he poured traditional tea into 2 small glasses. His dark eyes reflected neither surprise nor fear, only the quiet resolve of a man prepared for this moment. Show me the document, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had inspired a nation. As he read the charges, children's laughter drifted through the open window from the nearby school. Traoré's lips curved into a knowing smile that had nothing to do with amusement. Economic terrorism for feeding our own people with our own resources, he murmured to himself. His communications director entered nervously, clutching a stack of international news reports. The global media was already painting him as a dangerous, radical, threatening world stability. Traoré stood and walked to the window, gazing at the bustling market where women sold mangoes and millet. They fear what we represent more than what we've actually done. Within 2 hours, Traoré addressed the nation from the presidential palace courtyard. Hundreds of citizens had already gathered, their colorful traditional clothing creating a tapestry of solidarity. His voice carried across the crowd, without amplification, each word chosen with deliberate precision. Today, Washington has declared war on our sovereignty, on our right to control our destiny. The crowd's response was immediate, not panic, but a deep, resonant determination. Mothers lifted their children higher to see their leader, while elders nodded with approval. But we have faced colonial powers before, and we remain standing. The speech concluded with a promise that would echo across the continent. Let them come with their handcuffs and their arrogance, Traoré declared, his fist raised skyward. They will find not a cowering dictator, but a people united in dignity. The crowd erupted in ululations and applause that could be heard blocks away. Social media exploded with videos of the defiant speech within minutes. By sunset, our stand with Traoré was trending in 12 languages across 4 continents. The gauntlet had been thrown, and Africa was watching. President Xi Jinping's secure phone rang at precisely 6 a.m. Beijing time, interrupting his morning Tai Chi routine. His foreign minister's voice carried unusual urgency. The Americans are moving against Traoré in Burkina Faso. She paused mid-movement, his mind immediately calculating the geopolitical implications for China's Belt and Road investments. The morning mist over Zhongnanhai seemed to thicken as he processed this unexpected development. Summon the African Union ambassadors immediately, he commanded, his tone betraying no emotion. Within hours, Chinese diplomatic machinery was mobilizing across 3 continents. The chessboard had suddenly shifted, and Beijing would not be caught unprepared. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin received the intelligence briefing while reviewing military exercises in the Caucasus. His weathered face remained impassive, but his advisors recognized the predatory gleam in his eyes. The Americans' overreach once again, he muttered, setting down his tea glass with deliberate precision. Russian Wagner operatives already stationed in West Africa received new coded instructions within the hour. Putin's press secretary began drafting statements about Western neocolonial aggression against sovereign African nations. The Kremlin's disinformation networks activated across social media platforms, amplifying anti-American sentiment. Russia's grain shipments to Burkina Faso would increase 3-fold by month's end. In Ankara, President Erdogan convened an emergency session with his National Security Council. Turkey's growing influence in Africa had made Traoré a valuable partner in challenging Western hegemony. If they can arrest one African leader for defending his resources, none are safe, Erdogan declared. Turkish military advisors in Burkina Faso received orders to increase their protective posture immediately. The Turkish lira strengthened against the dollar as Ankara announced expanded trade agreements with African nations. Erdogan's personal call to Traoré lasted 47 minutes. Their conversation, conducted in fluent French. By evening, Turkish cargo planes were en route to Ouagadougou with humanitarian supplies. The dominoes continued falling across the global south as news spread through diplomatic channels. India's External Affairs Ministry issued a strongly worded statement about selective application of international law. Brazil's president called an emergency BRICS meeting to discuss coordinated responses to American overreach. Even traditional U.S. allies in the Gulf began questioning the precedent this arrest warrant might set. The Iranian Foreign Ministry gleefully announced increased oil cooperation with African nations facing Western pressure. What Trump intended as isolated punishment had become a rallying cry for multipolarity. The global chess game had begun, and America was no longer playing alone. The first video appeared on TikTok at 3:17 a.m. Laros time, uploaded by a 19-year-old Nigerian student named Amara. Her passionate 5-minute monologue about African dignity reached 100,000 views within 2 hours. They want to arrest our brother for refusing to be their slave, she declared, her hijab framing determined eyes. The video's raw emotion struck a nerve across the continent's youth networks. Within 6 hours, Sugar Hands Off Tiaro had exploded across every social media platform imaginable. Young Africans from Cape Town to Cairo began sharing their own video responses. The digital revolution had found its rallying cry, and it was spreading like wildfire. Twitter's algorithms couldn't contain the organic surge of solidarity sweeping across global networks. Kenyan tech entrepreneurs coordinated hashtag campaigns with precision military operations with envy. South African musicians release impromptu songs celebrating Burkina Faso resistance. Their videos garnering millions of views. Ghanaian diaspora communities in London and New York organized flash mob protests in Times Square. Instagram stories feature traditional African flags alongside modern protest art, created in real time. The platform's executives watched helplessly as user engagement reached unprecedented levels around African political content. Even celebrity influencers began posting solidarity messages, amplifying the movement's reach exponentially. Professional Western media outlets scrambled to control the narrative as grassroots content overwhelmed their carefully crafted stories. BBC and CNN found their comment sections flooded, with articulate African voices challenging every biased headline. University students across the Sahel created viral educational threads, explaining the historical context of resource extraction. Ethiopian programmers developed secure communication apps specifically for organizing continental resistance movements. The generation that had grown up with smartphones refused to let legacy media define their leaders. French television stations watched their viewership plummet as young Africans created their own news networks. The information war was shifting decisively toward authentic African voices. By sunset in Dakar, the hashtag had been translated into 23 African languages and dialects. Elderly Go in Mali began incorporating Traoré's name into traditional praise songs. Videos spreading rapidly through WhatsApp groups. Moroccan artists created powerful digital murals depicting Trump's overreach as a new form of colonialism. The movement transcended political boundaries, uniting Africa's diverse peoples around shared experiences of Western interference. Tech-savvy youth coordinated protests. Schedules across multiple time zones with military precision. Silicon Valley executives realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Africa's digital awakening as a unified political force. The continent's youth had found their voice and the world was finally listening. The emergency meeting convened at 4:00 a.m. in Dubai's gleaming financial district, far from prying Western eyes. Representatives from 7 African nations sat around a mahogany table, their laptops displaying real-time commodity prices. Gentlemen, the time for economic sovereignty has arrived, declared Ghana's finance minister, his voice cutting through the air-conditioned silence. Nigeria's oil minister nodded gravely, pulling up charts showing global petroleum dependencies. The room's tension was palpable as they discussed weaponizing Africa's natural wealth for the first time. Outside, the Persian Gulf sparkled, in the pre-dawn darkness, reflecting the gravity of their historic decision. Within hours, the global economy would feel the tremors of their coordinated response. By 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, cobalt prices had spiked 23% as the Democratic Republic of Congo announced temporary export restrictions. A Tesla stock began bleeding value as investors realized the implications for electric vehicle production. Lithium shipments from Zimbabwe mysteriously encountered technical delays at all major ports simultaneously. South Africa's platinum mines experienced convenient maintenance issues affecting global automotive manufacturing. The London Metal Exchange erupted in chaos as traders frantically called their African contacts for clarification. American tech giants watched helplessly as their supply chains faced unprecedented disruption. The continent that had been exploited for centuries was finally using its leverage strategically. French energy companies scrambled as uranium supplies from Niger encountered bureaucratic complications at customs checkpoints. Germany's industrial sector faced immediate shortages of rare earth minerals essential for renewable energy. Technology. Chinese manufacturers, immune to the sanctions due to their diplomatic support, began receiving preferential access to African resources. The dollar weakened against major currencies as global markets realized America's vulnerability to African economic retaliation. Trump's advisors flooded the Oval Office with Urgent briefings about supply chain catastrophes. Wall Street analysts frantically recalculated the true cost of the Traoré warrant. The economic chess game had shifted dramatically in less than 12 hours. In Ouagadougou's central bank, Traoré met with his economic team as positive news flooded their secure communications. Our gold reserves have never been more valuable, observed the central bank governor, reviewing overnight price surges. International buyers were offering premium rates for direct African mineral deals, bypassing traditional Western intermediaries entirely. The African Development Bank announced emergency funding for nations facing Western economic pressure. Currency swap agreements between African nations strengthened their position against dollar-based sanctions. By evening, financial analysts in New York were calling it the most coordinated African economic response in modern history. The hunted had become the hunter, and the global economy was feeling the reversal. In the shade of an ancient baobab tree outside Ouagadougou, 87-year-old Mamadou Khan gathered his grandchildren as the evening call. The prayer echoed across the village. His weathered hands traced patterns in the red dust while explaining the day's momentous events. This is not the first time powerful men from across the ocean have tried to chain our leaders, he began, his voice carrying the weight of lived history. The children sat mesmerized as their grandfather's eyes reflected memories of colonial resistance dating back decades. Village. Women paused their evening cooking to listen, recognizing the gravity of this impromptu history lesson. The scent of wood smoke and millet porridge filled the air as 3 generations connected across time. This was how African wisdom passed from elder to youth through stories that made the present meaningful. In 1958, they told our grandfather SEU to the same lies they tell truer. Today, Khan continued, adjusting his traditional cap. His voice grew strong as he recounted how Guinea's first president had rejected French colonial dependency. Charles de Gaulle himself came to Conakry demanding submission in exchange for continued civilization and economic support. The old man's fist clenched as he described how Tay had chosen dignity over dependency. When Guinea voted for independence, the French stripped every telephone, every light bulb, even the toilet paper from government buildings. His grandchildren gasped at this petty cruelty, their young minds grappling with such vindictive behavior. But Guinea survived, and today we remember Tay as a hero, not a victim. The parallel to today's situation was unmistakable as Khan drew connections across the decades. Traoré stands where our ancestors stood, choosing sovereignty over servitude despite the threats and intimidation. His weathered finger pointed toward the presidential palace, visible in the distance. The methods change. Arrest, warrants instead of economic sabotage, but the goal remains the same. Village. Elders nodded knowingly, having witnessed similar patterns throughout their lifetimes. A young girl asked why powerful countries couldn't simply leave Africa alone to govern itself. Her grandfather's sad smile contained centuries of accumulated wisdom about power, greed, and the persistent nature of exploitation. The question hung in the evening air like incense from the nearby mosque. As darkness fell and traditional drums began their nightly rhythm, concluded his lesson with prophetic certainty. Mark my words, children, Traoré will not break under this pressure any more than our forefathers did. The family walked back toward their compound, passing neighbors engaged in similar conversations around cooking fires. Throughout the village, similar scenes were unfolding as elders connected past struggles to present challenges. The collective memory of African resistance was awakening, passed down through oral tradition in ways no colonial power had ever understood. History was not just being remembered, it was being actively continued by a new generation of leaders. The baobab tree stood sentinel over another chapter in Africa's long journey toward true independence. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa had never witnessed such unprecedented unity as 54 ambassadors converged for an emergency session. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed called the assembly to order at precisely 9 o'clock a.m. his voice resonating through the marble halls. Today, an attack on one African leader is an attack on our collective sovereignty, he declared, setting the tone. Delegates, who had spent years arguing over border disputes and trade agreements, suddenly found themselves speaking with one voice. The Senegal's ambassador stood first, followed immediately by representatives from Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa in rapid succession. Outside, protesters had already gathered their chant of African unity audible through the building's walls. This was the moment Pan-Africanists had dreamed of for decades, born from American overreach. President Cyril Ramaphosa's video address from Cape Town electrified the assembled delegates with its unprecedented directness. South Africa formally rejects any attempt by foreign powers to arrest African heads of state without African consent. He announced his words carried special weight given South Africa's complex history with international justice and the ICC. Nigeria's president followed with an equally strong statement threatening to withdraw from all bilateral treaties involving extradition to Western nations. The Egyptian foreign minister announced Cairo's immediate suspension of intelligence cooperation with American agencies operating on the continent. Morocco's representative shocked everyone by offering military protection to Traoré despite years of diplomatic tensions with Burkina Faso. Even traditionally pro-Western nations like Botswana and Rwanda expressed solidarity through their carefully worded statements. The resolution passed by unanimous vote for the first time in African Union history, creating a binding continental charter. No African leader shall be subject to arrest or detention by external powers for defending national sovereignty. The document proclaimed. Legal experts worked through the night, drafting mutual defense agreements that would activate if any signatory faced similar pressure. The AU's Peace and Security Council received emergency powers to coordinate military responses to foreign intervention. Traditional rivals like Ethiopia and Egypt pledged joint diplomatic missions to major world capitals. The Continental Passport project stalled for years, suddenly received full funding and priority status. Africa was finally speaking as one continent, not 54 separate voices. By evening, the earthquake's tremors had reached every major capital as African embassies delivered identical diplomatic notes. Washington received formal protests from 47 African nations within a 6-hour period. Window, overwhelming state, department capacity. European Union headquarters faced similar coordination as African. Ambassadors demanded emergency meetings with foreign ministers. The UN Security Council received a formal complaint signed by every African member nation. Simultaneously, Chinese and Russian diplomats watched with satisfaction as their patient investment in African relationships paid dividends. Trump's administration realized they had inadvertently created the strongest display of African unity since independence movements of the 1960s. The hunter had awakened to pride and now faced 54 roaring lions instead of one. The leaked documents appeared simultaneously on WikiLeaks, Al Jazeera, and 3 African news networks at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. NSA whistleblower Maria Santos had risked everything to expose the real reasons behind Traoré's arrest warrant. Her hands trembled as she uploaded the final encrypted file from her apartment in Arlington, Virginia. The documents revealed detailed plans to install a puppet government in Burkina Faso within 90 days. American mining corporations had promised Trump's campaign substantial donations in exchange for regime change. Assistance. French intelligence had provided target lists of African leaders to be neutralized through similar operations. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows of classified government servers. The most damaging revelation showed private communications between Trump and ExxonMobil executives discussing Burkina Faso's untapped oil reserves. Get rid of this troll problem, and we'll make you the richest ex-president in history, read one particularly incriminating message. Internal CIA memos detailed psychological profiles of African leaders deemed too independent for American interests. The documents expose a systematic plan to use international law as a weapon against resource-rich nations. French President Macron's personal involvement in orchestrating the warrant became undeniable through recorded phone conversations. Corporate lobbyists had literally written the arrest warrant's economic terrorism charges in A.K. Street law firm. The facade of justice crumbled under the weight of documented corruption and greed. Global media erupted as journalists verified the authenticity of every leaked document through multiple independent sources. The Guardian's front page headline read, "Trump's African coup, the secret war for Burkina Faso's resources." CNN found itself in the impossible position of reporting news that contradicted their own earlier coverage. African news networks experienced unprecedented viewership as their analysis proved more accurate than Western reporting. European parliaments called emergency sessions to address their complicity in American resource extraction schemes. The leaked audio recordings went viral on social media with Trump's voice clearly discussing African problem management. Swiss banking records showed suspicious transactions between American corporations and mysterious offshore accounts. In the Oval Office, Trump's rage-filled tirade could be heard through reinforced walls as his advisors delivered the catastrophic news. "Sir, our entire justification for the warrant has been exposed as fabricated," his chief of staff reported with visible trembling. Legal experts immediately advised withdrawing the charges to minimize international humiliation, but Trump's ego refused retreat. The leaked documents had transformed him from prosecutor to defendant in the court of global opinion. African leaders scheduled emergency press conferences to demand formal apologies and reparations. For decades of manipulation, the hunter had become the hunted, and the whole world was watching the predator's desperate thrashing. Justice was finally wearing an African face, and it was beautiful to behold. The emergency UN Security Council session convened at 2 p.m. New York time with global media satellites focused on the iconic building. Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for unprecedented transparency as cameras rolled into the usually closed chambers. Trump's Secretary of State sat isolated at the American delegation table, surrounded by hostile glares from African representatives. Ibrahim Traoré appeared via secure video link from Ouagadougou, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with American diplomatic panic. The leaked documents had been distributed to every delegation overnight, creating an atmosphere of barely contained outrage. Outside, thousands of protesters chanted, "Justice for Africa" in a dozen languages. The moment of truth had arrived and the whole world was watching. Traoré's address to the assembly was masterful in its quiet dignity and devastating precision. "Honorable delegates, you have seen the evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to destroy African sovereignty," he began. His voice carried across the chamber without amplification, each word chosen for maximum impact. The Burkina leader methodically presented each leaked document, connecting corporate greed to political manipulation with surgical accuracy. They sought to criminalize our pursuit of economic independence while secretly planning to steal our resources. His eyes never left the camera as he addressed not just the UN but the global audience. The American delegation squirmed visibly as Traoré systematically dismantled their fabricated case. The Secretary of State's rebuttal was a disaster that would be studied in diplomatic schools for decades. His hands shook as he attempted to dismiss the leaked documents as Russian disinformation campaigns. The African Union representative immediately stood, demanding to know which specific documents were falsified. European allies remained conspicuously silent, unwilling to defend the indefensible. American position publicly. China's ambassador delivered a scathing condemnation of neo-colonial intimidation tactics disguised as international justice. The Russian representative's knowing smile spoke volumes about Moscow's satisfaction with American humiliation. Even traditionally neutral Switzerland called for a full investigation into corporate manipulation of international law. As The session concluded. Trump's phone rang continuously with calls from panicked donors and advisors. The Warrant's withdrawal was announced through a TUR State Department press release at 4:47 p.m. African capitals. Erupted in celebration as news of the diplomatic victory spread across the continent. Traoré's final statement was broadcast live across 6 continents. Africa will never again bow to those who mistake our patience for weakness. The moment marked a turning point in global power dynamics that would reshape international relations for generations. The would-be victim had become the victor, and the aggressor faced the consequences of his overreach. 6 months after the failed arrest warrant, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the largest gathering of African leaders since independence. The African Renaissance Summit in Accra brought together presidents, prime ministers, and liberation heroes from across the continent. Ghana's Independence Square overflowed with delegates wearing traditional dress alongside modern business attire. Symbolizing Africa's evolution, Traoré's opening address would be remembered as the Accra Declaration, a defining moment for continental sovereignty. His voice carried the weight of ancestral wisdom as he spoke of dignity, reclaimed through unified resistance. The baobab trees lining the square seemed to lean in as if nature itself was listening. This was the moment African leadership finally matured into its full potential. What happened to me was not about one man or one nation, Traoré declared to thunderous applause. It was about whether Africa would accept permanent subordination or demand equal treatment in global affairs. His words resonated across the packed amphitheater as delegates from 54 nations nodded in unanimous agreement. The failed American intimidation had become a catalyst for unprecedented continental cooperation in economics, defense, and diplomacy. New trade agreements bypassed traditional Western middlemen, keeping African wealth within African borders. The continental free trade area gained momentum as nations realized their collective bargaining power. Young African entrepreneurs were finally receiving the support their parents' generation could only dream of. The Summit's final resolution established the African Sovereignty Defense Fund, pooling resources to protect future leaders from external pressure. Military cooperation agreements created rapid response capabilities for defending democratic governments against foreign interference. Educational exchanges multiplied as African universities strengthened partnerships independent of Western academic gatekeepers. The African Development Bank announced $50 billion in infrastructure investments funded entirely by continental resources. Currency cooperation reduced dependence on dollar-dominated international markets, strengthening regional economic independence. Traditional rivals like Nigeria and South Africa found common ground in shared experiences of Western manipulation. The dream of Pan-African unity was finally becoming practical reality. As the summit concluded with traditional drumming echoing across Accra, Traoré reflected on how adversity had forged strength. Trump's attempt at intimidation had backfired spectacularly, creating the very continental unity America had spent decades preventing. African youth now saw their leaders as dignified equals on the global stage, not supplicants begging for Western approval. The leaked documents continued inspiring transparency movements worldwide, holding powerful nations accountable for their hidden agendas. Traoré's phone buzzed with messages from leaders across the global south seeking advice on resisting superpower pressure. The hunted had become the teacher, and his lesson was spreading far beyond Africa's borders. History would remember this as the moment Africa finally stood up and never sat back down. Ibrahim Traoré's victory over Trump's intimidation proved that dignity and unity can defeat any bully. Africa's awakening has just begun, and the world will never be the same. What do you think about this historic moment? Subscribe for more incredible stories of African leadership and share your thoughts in the comments below.